say, is the best possible aspects of comparison, in the sense that he helps us see a contrast and connections between Buddhist violence in different places. The ways in which violence operates in the southern Thailand is different than the ways in which it works in Rakhine State and a broader anti-Muslim discourse elsewhere in Sri Lanka. But I think he helps us understand the connections that happen in those locations. And so bringing out the contrast actually gives us these insights about how things operate. And I also think it helps us understand the interconnections between it. The ways in which Buddhism and violence, or the violence happening in Buddhist places, is interconnected about larger discourses of perceptions of Buddhism and constructions of Buddhism in those places, but also how it intersects with larger discourses. So thinking about Rakhine State right now, thinking largely about an internationalist anti-migrant discourse colliding with a local anti-migrant discourse, and an anti-Muslim discourse colliding with a larger international anti-Muslim discourse. I think Michael's work, far from dismissing Buddhism as pacifist or allowing any sort of facile construction like this, he works to open up the questions and has challenged us to look at locally conflicted concepts of harm, how it is that Buddhism is constructed, harm is constructed, and violence is constructed in each of these places. I think importantly, he's opened up the questions of where religion, and especially where Buddhism resides within the problems that we look at. The possibility of challenging us to not look simply towards doctrine, towards text, even towards ritual or performance, but to think that Buddhism in the Buddhist violence we're looking at may reside in other opportunity or other aspects of this. I think particularly has helped shatter the concept, the construction of Buddhism as tolerant, Buddhism as peaceful, and open up the possibilities for having ourselves ask ourselves, how has that been constructed over time? How have we come to that in this particular place, in this particular conflict? More than this, he's demonstrated how paying attention to Buddhism and violence requires that we examine how Buddhism is constructed, both in our own discourses, our academic discourses, but also how it's locally constructed by the actors in the sets of conflicts that we look at. In some of this, he has some work on Buddhist exceptionalism that's been particularly helpful and insightful for me. Also the postscript to When You Meet the Buddha, he suggests we look at the position of monks and the authority of monks as itself as the location of Buddhism and the ways in which they operate as a vector for Buddhism within this discourse of violence. I'm interested here not just in the implications of studying anti-Muslim discourse in Burma, obviously this is exactly where we intersect, but also because I think it draws our attention to culture and vectors of authority in the operations of these things. If the questions of what is Buddhist about this discourse, its inciting violence, the answer might not lie in content or the justification or the cosmology or those larger things we're used to looking at, that may simply be in the mode of transmission and the authority through which it operates. And in this I begin to think that I'd be really interested to sort of engage that postscript more, in part because of some of the revelations that come out more recently about the ways in which the violence that's operated in Rakhine State. For a long time, our interlocutors and Burmese friends have tried to say, well, the military is behind this, and I think a lot of us resisted trying to say this because out of an ethical stance, we wanted to say, no, you need to be introspective. This discourse of violence is much broader, it's through the culture, it's pervasive. But actually, and that part is certainly true. The monks have been a vector of violence and the authority through which they operate. But what has come out more recently is that there actually are other vectors. We've long known how Facebook has operated to spread this level of hatred, but we've also come to know now that the Burmese military was using a particular psychological warfare operations, and were creating fake Facebook accounts to flow this. And so out of this particular operation by the military then, the questions of where the location of Buddhism in this violence, this discourse of violence operates, I was reading that last chapter, thinking about those questions, and actually thinking about the ways in which that wasn't a problem when you wrote it, but actually that chapter opens up all of those possibilities because we think about the location of Buddhism and the flow of authority through a much broader sense of medium and levels of transmission. And where Buddhism is in each of those things, in fake Facebook accounts, in military going to Russia to learn how to set up fake translate that is something huge. I'm also deeply, deeply grateful that his work at the same moment as looking at militaristic violence puts structural violence next to it and ask about the role of structural violence, both in the militaristic violence itself, but also in the larger Buddhist context. His focus on identity in his written work and created space to think about violence with larger structures. He was recently at a Buddhist ethics conference focused on race, class, and gender, and he was it was wonderful to be there with his comments because I was thinking at one point, he's the person whose written work actually engages these things at a clear level with talking about violence more broadly. And that each of these aspects of structural violence was there in his conversations already. But I also think his dedication to thinking about the ways in which structural violence operates, gendered violence, the violence of class politics, and the violence of identity and ethnicity, it goes well beyond the sort of written academic work that he's brought together. So we had long conversations about the gendered and class-structured nature of academic work that were clear to me informed his reflections on Buddhist context. And more than that, it's clear in his practice and his life that these are dedications. He's one of the few cisgendered men I know who's clear about his pronouns in all places. You can't write him an email without creating a space that is open to queer folks and transgendered people. And that is to be appreciated in a public place. That doesn't happen in Buddhist studies, let's be clear. And it's an important thing. So creating these spaces where everyone is possible. And more than that, so if his Facebook account is to be believed, and I don't have some Burmese military fake Facebook account for you, you're also clearly currently in a local fight to make sure there's a women's center and to create spaces within your own campus for that. So in this, I think I want to highlight that Michael works as a role model of ethical engaged scholarship. As we've said, he does to his subjects, he gives Buddhists the respect of being critical and not sympathetic. So to be critical of Buddhist violence itself, to be critical of the discourses that's there, rather than repeating and acting as a sympathizer. He's a person who took stance in his scholarship from the beginning. His ethical positions are clear in the content of his work and his uncompromising stances. Not only has he been prolific, which a lot of us are deeply jealous of and don't understand how that works, but he's taken risks in his scholarship, and clearly personal risks. He's taken risks of being banned from his field sites, of being banned from speaking, but he's also seems to be quite clear in his written work that the risks that he takes are minor compared to the risks of his informants. And that too is an ethical position. But I also think his ethical engagement is there in his practice of scholarship. He's engaged in lots of collaborative work that helps bring other voices to the table. And it's clear in what I've seen and interacted with, he's wonderful about welcoming young scholars and scholars of Asian descent. There's a lot of background work that happens in academia. If it's done well, you never ever see it. But it is the work of supporting someone and helping them bring forth their argument, of collaborating and carefully helping a young scholar come to a voice. And I've seen him do this. So his work of being collaborative and helpful has grown the field in this way. And I think its implications are much broader than we might see otherwise. So I just want to say I'm honored to be here and that I'm really pleased to be able to comment.
Eric Davis.
Hi everyone, I'm Eric Davis, Callister College, and like everyone else, I am deeply honored to have been invited to join this panel in honor of Michael Jerryson. I was not entirely certain why I was invited, and so that's what I'm going to talk about. When I think about why was I invited, I was thinking, well, okay, so I do ethnography, sort of. I do some Buddhism stuff. I am in Southeast Asia. Also, Michael and I share some activist-y sort of interests and outside of the academy things in some ways. And I'm trying to think, well, golly, what do I do here? Because I don't write about Buddhism and violence, really. I don't actually bring my politics too much. I'm not a public scholar. And so what I want to talk about is the ways in which Michael is completing or making it possible for me to not complete my work and still feel whole. All right. So I'll tell you that story by telling you that I grew up partly on a small farmhouse in southern Minnesota. It was not our farm. My dad was a pastor. We got the house. And because we were isolated, my mom didn't know what to do with me. I probably maybe have undiagnosed ADHD, so that may have something to do with it. At one day, she couldn't take me anymore, and she gave me a spade, and she sent me out next to the cornfield and said, dig. And inside of about 4.5 hours, I dug something that was about, so if you get the analogy of what a trailer, you know what a double wide trailer is, it would have been a double wide grave. And I just had that much time to do, and I dug my own little hole, and I didn't know what I was doing with it. It wasn't very connected to anything else, and I didn't know what I was going to catch. The next day, I caught a combine. A combine came through and fell in the hole. So there were consequences to what I had done, but they weren't planned, and they weren't connected to other things. What I really like about what Michael's work does in his own life and what it makes it possible for me to do is to make connections that make my own ditch digging seem to make more sense. And so here's the way that works out in practical reality for me. I don't write about Buddhism and violence, that's not the work I do. I'm interested in Buddhism and violence because I'm interested, as was so eloquently said earlier, about Michael's orientation, I'm interested in suffering. And I think Michael's orientation towards suffering has been one of the most consistent, critical, honest, and cohering things that I can see in his career, and which has made, when I say cohering, I don't just mean cohering his career, it helps cohere mine, and that's the theme I want to run with, right? Is that he's helping cohere mine, because I don't do that work. For whatever reason, I fire on a bunch of different cylinders all at the same time, and none of them seem to tie together. I go to work, and I do my teaching, and I go do my activisty stuff elsewhere, and I have kids, and I do that stuff, and they're all just kind of parallel. What it looks like from the outside, and I'm sure it's a lie, I'm sure I am not seeing Yakabutam, I'm not seeing the world the way it really is that Michael seems to have known from the beginning that he had an orientation, he had a set of interests, he had a way in which he was going to approach the topics that he cared about, and that this caring was not in separate planes, the way mine so often feels. This caring sort of connected these various parts and dimensions of his life in a way that was really meaningful. And when I started teaching, I got a job in 2007, and I knew I wanted to do, I was teaching Intro to Buddhism. What do you do? Graduates teaching Intro to Buddhism. What can I teach them? Well, the ability to blow up the idea that Buddhism is all these things that everyone else has already covered, right? Is this, pacifistic, beautiful. I mean, you kind of imagine Mickey Mouse in sort of robes, and it's like, who's going to hurt anybody? And, it's this lovely thing, and it's completely, he completely throws it apart. The idea of showing the monk with a gun on the cover of the book and just watching students' responses, there's a real power to being able to explode that preconception. And when I have been able to bring Michael's work, and I have taught, because of Michael's work, I have taught the work of many other people on this panel, and that is the order in which that happened, is that I started with Michael's work and then started bringing other people in as things developed. He made it possible for me to bring those concerns and those interests into the classroom in a way that I would not have been able to on my own. And that class is definitely the most popular class I teach. It's the class that people walk away going, wow, I didn't realize Buddhism was actually, a religion. I didn't know people did, like there was humans in there. I didn't know that was a thing, right? And so it's always been extremely important to me when I think about sort of the work Michael does, is how, at least from the outside, it seems so coherent and so precise and so unitary. And it makes what is my own internal experience of separation between the different parts of my lives. Michael, you complete me. Okay? And so if I was going to return to my garden, That ditch I dug, right? I was actually finally managed to go back to that village, it's a village, about 3 years ago. And somebody else is growing a garden there. And it's actually growing things. But there's a weird shape inside that garden where things are growing a little better than the rest of the stuff. And I didn't do any of the planting in there. And I didn't do any of the selection of the seeds, or the weeding, or the watering. I didn't have any control over the sun. But I did some of the work there a long time ago. And that made it possible for somebody else to do even better work, which made somebody eating vegetables. I was never going to grow those vegetables. I clearly didn't have the skill. But what I want to sort of connect that to here is the way in which Michael's work has made my work possible, and made my work more unitary, and my life more unitary, in a way that I find very complimentary, and for which I'm very, very grateful. Michael came to visit McAllister and talk in 2015 in the winter. It was a very, very, very bad winter. Now maybe coming from Youngstown, it wasn't a big deal, but you know, it was a bad winter, and he came and talked about Buddhism and fascism and politics to my students, and it was very reassuring. It was very reassuring to watch somebody else say things in a way that felt more academically supported and valid and authoritative than the stuff I had been sort of repeating at my students through the semester. And it made it possible for me to continue teaching in the way that I do. So Michael, you've had a huge influence on my teaching, to the extent that my students have had any influence from me. You've had a huge influence on them. And you have made my ability to conceptualize the weird multiplanar aspects of my own life as connected in a way that I find extremely helpful. Thank you so much.
Now, Michael, before you stand up, I'd like to ask Jamel Belgi to say a word or two. Jamel is my co-conspirator in putting this panel together, and has worked with Michael as the coordinator and co-coordinator of this unit for a while. Jamel, thank you for your role in putting this panel together and for working with Mike. You just stand up there if you wish. You don't have to come up in front.
Let me come up.
Okay. We've established Jamel is shy around the ladies, but not shy in front of the classroom. So.
Taking Eric's cue, I also have to tell everybody about how Michael completes me. Many years ago, when we were in graduate school together, Michael said, you know, you should really ask out. There's this woman, Chloe, and I was like, no, I don't know if I'm too shy. Hence Mark says I'm shy around the ladies. How did we get so off topic? But Michael. And I was like, no. And he's like, no, yes, you should do it. And we are now, 13 years into our marriage, so I have to publicly acknowledge Michael Jerryson. But the real reason... I'm very shy around her. But the real ostensible reason I'm here is to talk about my role with Michael as being co-chair of the Comparative Approaches and Religion Violence Unit at the American Academy of Religion. And I just want to highlight 3 really amazing things that I learned about working with Michael over the past 3 years as co-chair of this unit with him, many of which have been said before. But the first thing is that I noted immediately within the first 2 weeks that Michael has this dogged dedication and commitment to illuminating the suffering of lesser-known communities and undoing these dominant narratives. This is really, really critical to his being. And I have seen this in the ways in which he also encourages graduate students and others to submit across a wide range of topics pushing the geographical envelope. The more geographically diverse, the more focus on the global south, The more we can compare, the more we can make this a human phenomenon, all the better. And Michael has a real dedication to this. The second thing I want to mention is his commitment toward mentoring graduate students. Graduate students in particular who submit proposals to the AAR conference are frequently clueless as to what they are doing. And Michael will be one of the few people who gets over email and sends these like long emails. It's like, in order to make your presentation proposal better, I would encourage the following. And you read these documents and they're just beautiful. And you realize, like, how is this guy so prolific, as somebody said? I mean, he's writing these books and then he's writing these long emails. And many people write back and say, I have never seen anybody do this for me, and thank you. The third thing is that he is a superlative administrator. I don't know if you people know him as this, but he is, this is weird to me, because he's doing all of these things, but he can also keep track of like 15 different threads. And this is all, I mean, I should show you my inbox. Every week I get 10 to 15 bulk messages from Michael. Each of the emails have different subjects. And then he'll follow up, like 2 weeks later, do we do this, do we do this, do we do this? And I'm like, no. And weren't you supposed to do that? And he's like, no, it's you. So, thank you, Michael.
I suppose since we have a few minutes, if anyone else who is not on the panel want to add a word, this is probably a good time to do it. You don't need to come up to this microphone, you can just stand where you are. But not seeing, there's a hand. All right, yes, originally we had hoped you would say something.
Hi everyone. I'm one of those non-traditional students who I was honored to be on a panel with Dr. Jerrison, and his feedback completely changed the scope of my career, honestly. I was one of those kids that I was 15 and I was a high school dropout, right? I was a gang member. I have both my parents are felons. I didn't really have a future, right? And when I got into academia, I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out how to write and put things together because I've never had any kind of, teaching. And I'm sorry, I'm emotional. And Dr. Jerrison, along with my incredible mentors, where I went to school at Florida International University, they've molded me into being someone who was willing to go into the field, and maybe that's the gangster in me, right? I was willing to work with terrorists and do things that were so brave, but it was really just modeling after him and following his example and being encouraged by someone who was so respected and introduced me to language that I never thought I would ever be able to not reproduce, but hopefully one day reproduce. So thank you for existing.
Thank you for those comments. Yes, Vesna.
I remember the first day when Michael walked into my office and said, I'm done with Mongolia. And I want
And he said that to you of all people.
He said, I really want to work something on engage Buddhism, Southeast Asia. I said, Michael, I don't know, this is not my area. I was very apprehensive. I said, well, we need to find somebody for you to lead you in this direction. And it was wonderful to see this development, he was traveling. And I remember when Michael was going to Thailand first time, he came also to my office. He says, I may not come back. I may die, be shot there. So please make sure that they don't bring my body back. because it will cost them lots of money. So my parents, they can just tell them to leave my body there. And I was like, didn't know what to do with this. This is like a big responsibility. But it showed how dedicated he was. And Michael was not one of the most diligent. He was the most diligent student I have had in 20 years at UCSB. And somehow he was so balanced. He was a great husband, really loving husband. And he was also great humanitarian even then. I remember Michael going on vacations to visit his parents, and he would go and do humanitarian work with them. He says, this is what my family believes. So he seems like he never took a break. And whatever he did it in such a wonderful, gracious, wholesome ways.
Great, thank you, Esther. Anyone else like to add a comment? Yes, Ben. Stand up so we can hear you.
So I'm Ben Schulthal. I've known Michael for a while. Santa Barbara, a little behind him. If you think it was intimidating to teach him, then it was like to be behind him. And then behind him my whole career and watching as he did things. I think everyone in this room, just about our vintage, I mean, has stood in total admiration. And a lot of what I've heard today, I do the tip of the iceberg, and I just want to acknowledge how overwhelming it is to hear how remarkable you are in all aspects of your life. Obviously, that plus. Just also just add a note that of the scholars I know who do this kind of work, put themselves in harm's way, write things that might be taken different ways. Not many of us can do that. Even those of us who think we can speak to policymakers, we don't have the courage a lot of the time. And something that, besides being the most diligent person I've ever met as well, you're, I think, the scholar that I think of that's got the most courage of anybody I know. And I just want to say that in the room and to say I'm still just now even more in admiration of everything you've done, man. So, you.
Like Ben, I thought I'd known everything there was to know about you, Michael, but in this panel I've learned so much more. You know, Michael, this was supposed to be a panel to review your scholarship. And it turned out to be increasingly a panel to discuss you as a person. And then I realized that in your case, the two are so closely intertwined that you can't talk about Michael the scholar without talking about him as a person. You can't talk about Michael the person without his scholarship and his intellectual curiosity. And what a compliment that is to be able to say that about something. So we're all fans of yours, Michael, and we're so proud to be a part of this panel and to give you an opportunity now to have a word of your own. Please come.
It's hard not to be emotional. I mean, Eric, you had me at ADHD. But it's amazing how when you hear others talk about yourself, you see yourself in a prism in a way you've never seen yourself before, and it almost makes you tongue-tied. And it reminds me of hearing an interview with Daniel Kahneman. He's an acclaimed psychologist who had problems too hearing this, but he talked about the fact that his success was largely due to luck, and luck in terms of collaborations. And he said the world is not kind to collaborators, and I think he's very true with that. I was very lucky, for example, at the beginning of my PhD, and this is terrible to say this, 9/11 happened, and I got a chance to work with Mark because of that. There was an open, suddenly, TA-ship, and I came in that way into global studies. And I was lucky to have a faculty member who, when it came down to helping me with Buddhist warfare, and Marcus and I were co-editing it, he turned to the publisher at the time, the Oxford, and he says, no, I don't need the royalties for this. Let Michael have it. And of stories about faculty, senior faculty that just take, graduate students' work and make it their own. And I had the opposite in a mentor in ways like this.
And they wouldn't let me do it. Tried to take my name off it.
Eric Davis talked about the focus on suffering. Many of you did talk about this, and I know, Chris, you're asking about the question of origins for this too. Where does it come from? And this is also, I also share with Daniel Kahn this idea that I think it's a mistake to start looking into why we can make people more happy. I don't think our job is to figure out ways to make people more happy. I think our job is to figure out how we can minimize suffering, which is a very different thing. And the origin of this, I think, perhaps we could say, because of my background, I'm not Jewish anymore. I actually got excommunicated my senior year in high school from that. But, that's a long story. Anyway, I think growing up Jewish granted me the ability to see what it was like to not be included in U.S. society in a normative way. We hear about this with other people too, so it gave you that glimpse. But really, for me, if I have to reflect back on what gave me the fuel for this, and this is kind of morbid in some ways. I remember when I was 3 years old, and my mother has cases of clinical depression, and she was on the couch and she couldn't move, and she was asking for help with this 3-year-old, and I was just very young, and I realized at that point that I wanted to help her, but I couldn't. My mother was suffering, and I couldn't do anything about it. And that, I think, inability drove me to focus more on people's sufferings and trying to help them. In so many ways, I think what happens in our early childhood begins to germinate and grow in different directions. And I think that's happened very much with me in this case. I appreciate Alicia's comments about the postscript. In many ways, Alicia, you started me on this path too. We were at a Association of Asian Studies conference, and people were wondering what was going on in Myanmar at the time. Alicia was on a panel, and she says, "You guys don't understand. The biggest argument in Burmese Buddhism was not about doctrine. It was about, how to wear your robes. It was about ritual." And people were like, "What?" And it was a great way of reframing, thinking of things beyond what we call orthodoxy or doctrine, getting beyond that. And it got me thinking more about authority, whether it's in ritual, or if it's in culture, or if it's in doctrine. And I think it's a play of all three. And in the same way, too, I like the honoring the focus on structural violence. I've actually had to fight to keep structural violence in my work. My last work, my recent one on If You Meet the Buddha on the Road, one of the reviewers wrote back saying, gender discrimination, blasphemy, that's not violence. This shouldn't be in the book. That's different. And I wrote back to the publisher saying, "Look, I appreciate that point of view, but I just strongly disagree. I think some of these issues of violence are more pervasive, discrimination, whether it's racial, gender, sexual orientation, and so forth, and they undergird not on just a personal level, but on a societal level. It's there, it's everywhere. It permeates into warfare and conflict. In many ways, too, I think our focus on war and conflict is a very Western, almost masculine way of looking at violence. It ignores domestic abuse, other things taking place. And I really believe structural violence needs to be front and center. It was interesting at the Buddhist Ethics Conference, too. We had the same issue where some people were thinking, why should we focus on gender? And it's like this ethics conference. I'm like, because it's so important. Because discrimination is so important to look at. Violence is not just simply about guns and knives. But the thing that's lost too, I think I realized in all my studies is that whether we like it or not, violence is a form of agency. And I learned that from Ashish Nandi's work. It's a way of making yourself feel heard. And I think that point's so important now because when all other avenues of our voices are blocked, we turn to violence as a means of being heard. And I disagree with people arguing that we're in the age of anger. No, we're in the age of fear right now. And if we don't listen to people's fears, they will take their agency in a different direction. They'll take it to violence. So it's important to listen. Whether we agree with them or not, listen to the fears. Listen to fears reduces how much fear you have. Dismissing fear increases it. And it converts to anger, it converts to hatred this way. And we see this. I mean, I live close to Pittsburgh, and right, Bauer's attack on the horrific attack on synagogue and 11 dead, and listening to the rhetoric, it mirrors so much with what's Dylan Roof and others talking. And they're coming out of places of fear. And so, whether we like it or not, I think we need to understand and have them realize that we're hearing their fear and work in ways to try to reframe and discuss things. I gave a talk at a retirement community recently on Islamophobia, and I put up there statistics about deaths, murders in the United States, and it was like something like, I don't know if you've seen this before, it's a really interesting way of looking at our focus on violence. So about 2 to 3 Americans are dying a year from jihadists at the most. And it was like 9 Americans from non-Muslim people that are terrorists, like Bowers just fulfilled that with making it 11 already, right, this year. But then it gets another statistics, like people die from lawnmowers, much higher. People get hit by like lightning, much higher. People fall out of bed, it's like over 700 people die from each shift in bed. And then of course the last statistic is over 11,000 people die in the United States each year from guns, and from shooting. And I showed this, and of course some people were like, well, what this? Well, no. And I had someone come up to me afterwards, and she was in her 60s, and she's lived in the community for a long time. She said, Dr. Jerison, I don't understand though, because Islam's a threat. I mean, Dearborn, Michigan, they're trying to create Sharia law here, and I'm so worried about it. And I brought back to things like, you're right. There is issues of ISIS, there's issues of recruits. So I understand that fear. I mean, what do you think about the statistics I brought up, about the amount of fear? Does it resonate with you that you should be that fearful about Muslim terrorists when it comes to these other statistics? And she paused and she was thinking, well, yeah, it doesn't make sense. And so to be able to first hear her and then reframe it, I thought was a very productive way of doing things. And I feel blessed to have been given these privileges. I think being male, being white, gave me a foot up in ways that others didn't, to be able to get the education, to get the interviews, to get the appointments to do this. And I think as others have said, I think we have privilege. It's important to speak out for those who don't. Erica mentioned, he doesn't know why, perhaps you could invite on the panel. When Mark asked me for people that I would like to have on the panel, I was like, well, you shouldn't ask me. But I think it was people I admired for various reasons. Chris's work on Engage Buddhism, starting on the path of looking at engagement in these ways. Susan's work is, I think, tireless, and her perseverance working for the greater good, even though Congress, she's the whim of Congress, and the little money they put towards your work. And of course, how much she has to cover in Southeast Asia alone is incredible. Alicia Turner with her journal studies and always working to link and help other junior faculty out and graduate students, incredible. And Abby's meteoric rise at Indiana, or Eric Davis's. Davis's work with Deaf Power is so trenchant, insightful. His wit is, you could probably get a sense of it just from his talk. So that's why I guess part of the reasons why I gave that list there, and I so appreciate this opportunity and feel very humbled by these words. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Michael, and thank all of you for being a part of this very special occasion. Take care and go out and read all of his works. There's a book cited right at present. The latest, of course, is If You Meet Buddha on the Road, and all of you Buddhist scholars know the rest of that quote. Thank you, Michael, for everything you've done, and thank all of you for being here. Good night.